Welcome to the LB's The Lover of Books Author Chat. If this is your first time here live or watching the recording, I'm so glad you found us. I've had the honor to interview over 75 debut to best-selling authors, and yes, today is a debut author. But all of you have helped my YouTube channel, LB The Lover of Books, grow. It's now amassed over 22,000 hours watched, and I really appreciate you taking that time to like, to comment, and share that content with other readers. That's how they find us. But now I want to introduce this talented debut author, Sarah Damoff. Her writing has appeared in Oprah Daily, Porterhouse Review, and Open Global Rights, among other publications. She holds a degree in family studies and a child protection certification from Harvard University. Texas native, what? She lives in Dallas with her husband and children, and we are definitely here to discuss her first book, The Bright Years. Welcome, Sarah. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, Laura Beth, and thank you all for being here from all over the place.
I know it's exciting. All right, I'm just going to kick us right off, and sounds like maybe a common love, probably amongst a lot of us. But you started this. Oh, before I forget, if you were watching this recording, this is spoiler full. So if you're worried about spoilers and you haven't finished, you might want to pause it, finish it, and come back. So I'm going to go ahead and start with this. The relationship. It starts in a public library. Why did you place them in that public library? Was there some intention there? If so, why?
So, I think more than anything else, it was important to me that there was a reference to A Tree Grows in Brooklyn. And I love a library. So, it's interesting the mix as a writer of things that are intentional and things that are just kind of subconscious. And sometimes you can't even parse which one is which, and it just kind of comes out. But if many of you have probably read A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, but there's some similarities. It's not at all a retelling, but the father in that book struggles with alcoholism, and it's a family story with a very strong sense of place, a very realistic sense of place, but of course a fictional family, and just a beautiful book. And so I wanted to just have a little nod to that book, and that was kind of led me to then set her in the library.
Well, was it always planned that this would be in Texas because you are a Texan? Just like you can't imagine, tree grows in Brooklyn anywhere but in Brooklyn at this point.
Yeah, it was really fun for me because it's an area I know well, and I don't think you always have to do that as a writer, but it was also my first attempt at, a novel, and so I figured that would help me if it was a place that I was familiar with. And I love reading about cities like New York and Paris. There are a lot of books set in those cities. And so it was a fun opportunity for me to kind of bring to life a city here in the South that I know well, and it felt like it fit their family. So yes, that was always planned. I will say that the book began as my entire first draft was epistolary, so it was all letters. It was written in letters, and the sense of place and the sense of time were very vague at the beginning. So the very first major edit I did was like, I was figuring out the relationships and the dynamics there. And so I just was kind of like, okay, now I have to go back and really ground it in like, where are we in time? Where are we in place? So that was like early on in the process. But the very first thing that kind of came out was what's the story of these relationships? And then I was kind of like, okay, they're floating around. Like, we need to make this like, where are they and when are they? And I didn't know that it was going to span as many years as it did. And so that was fun as well to include that in the setting.
Well, we will definitely get to Texas. I know that's no shock to all of you that I want to discuss Texas, but I want to discuss something you just said, setting it in time. And I felt like you were very intentional in that. I mean, we had something extremely newsworthy, the Davidian compound. We had Princess Diana's death. There were so many points that happened to ground us in those years and decades. Why did you choose to do that? Number one. And number two, how do you even decide what you're going to give us? Because there are so many options, right?
Right. Yeah, that's a great question. I think when I started including those things, it felt very natural to me, and I didn't realize that it's not the most common thing to do in a novel until later. But it was because I was spanning so many years, and because these characters in this family began to feel so real to me, and particularly when I hit years. So the way I first wrote it was you're kind of getting these highlights. Again, it was written in letters. And so it's not necessarily, sometimes there would be, as you know from reading the book, it still was this way where you might have several things happen, several chapters where we're all in the same month, but then you skip ahead a couple years. And that's just how the structure of this book was. And that came from it being in letters. But when I hit points in time where I'm like, okay, we're with this 15-year-old girl who's just had this tragic loss, and it's 2001. Oh, I will also say, I intentionally did the timeline so that it would end before the pandemic, because that introduces a completely different dynamic and story that wasn't this story. And so the book ends in 2019, and so I had to work backwards from there and then think like, okay, so that was kind of my starting point, and I based the timeline around that. So when I'm like, we're in 2001, she would think about the way we do, like it would be massive in a 15-year-old's life that the towers fell, like that this was a big thing. And so it almost feels disingenuous to not include things like that. So when I started doing that, and of course the Branch Davidians, I'm Jet's age, exactly, which was also helpful and intentional. But so I was like very, very young when that happened, but I know it was really important in American history and specifically Texas history. And so it was fun to be able to think about not necessarily a commentary on those actual events, but more like how would these things that are happening impact, how would these characters think about them or not think about them, because that's how we really live. Our personal lives are front and center, as they should be, because we are ourselves. But then always in the background is kind of the hum of what's happening in the broader society. And so it just felt natural to me and almost unnatural to not have, I didn't want it to be too much, but to not have some of that, because I think they would think about how does this major event connect with myself and my own life.
So you said you started from 2019 and work backward, but Jet is your age. So is that how you worked it, so that you knew that she would be born the year that you were born, and then you would work your way forward?
Yeah, it kind of worked out like that. As I said, the first draft had no years. It was just like more like age, like how old is Lillian and when these things are happening. And so when I realized we're spanning all this time, it was kind of two things at once, and it worked out well together because I knew I don't want to get into 2020. And as soon as I realized, I didn't know exactly what age Jet was. I knew she was like between 12 and 17, 18 when she would lose her mom, but I had a little flexibility. And then it just was kind of like a light bulb where I was like, I still am going to have to do research, but it would just be easier for me as a writer to think like, when Jet and I were 14 and 15, is that when we were getting phones? Like, you can Google all these things, but it was nice for me to be able to remember, like, well, what did I do at that age? Because that's the age she is. So it was just a helpful little writer cheat, I guess, to make her my same age.
Well, Laura has a great question, and I definitely wondered the same thing. Can you talk about your music references in the book and how much the music inspired your writing? I mean, I know we hit Mariah Carey's All I Want for Christmas, which everybody knows that song and when it came out. So, but there were a lot of music references from Beatles to Coldplay to Kenny G,
Yeah,
which I did use in my post today. I couldn't help not get
I
Kenny
noticed that. Yeah.
G. Can you talk about that music and how it affected your writing?
Yeah, it's so funny. I think people like on Instagram will use Kenny G, and I'm sure the people who haven't read the book are like, why? But yeah, it's again, that was really similar to what we were just talking about in that it felt natural to me. And part of that is, I think it's not only music, but art, visual art as well, is very important in this book. And that is just reflective of the way I live my life and think. And I'm constantly noticing music and art and how important those things are, especially when you're going through times of brokenness or grief. Those things can be such a comfort and a source of healing. And also it's just like I my background, it's been a long time, but as a child, my life was theater. And I write in such a way where I'm like inhabiting the character. I'm thinking like, sometimes I'll even, get up and walk around to think like, what would they realistically be doing with their bodies and their face and their interactions? And so I'm just very vividly imagining these scenes. And really, like, music is everywhere. You go to the grocery store, you go wherever. And so again, that was something that as they came to life, it just felt like, well, that would be here. And sometimes that adds like humor and comedy, because you're like, why is this random song playing? And then sometimes it's very profound and meaningful. And I know, aside from the Kenny G, the most common song that people talk about or post with their reviews is going to be Here, There, and Everywhere with the Beatles, and that was used so meaningfully. And yeah, that came to mind immediately for me as like what they would dance to at her wedding, and so I thought that was perfect. So yeah, it was kind of natural for me because music is important to me, and I just kind of notice it everywhere as I'm going about my life. And that was something I'll say in the writing of this book. This isn't every book and every writer, and it may not be every book I write, but in this book, instead of asking like, what's the most unusual or surprising, I kept asking like, what's the most common experience of fill in the blank, like of alcoholism, of adoption, of going like the big things and the small things. And so that's all part of it, is that how is this relatable to us? How would this really feel to me? And, music is one small part of that.
Yeah, I mean, it's not a fringe book, I would say. It's one that could happen to any family, any person at any time with any of these themes or tragedies or happy, all the things. It's life. And so I think that grounding it in those commonalities was huge and a great decision. Um, okay, I want to jump because you mentioned it as an artwork, music, literature, but one of the pieces of art in this book is a gallery studio. And when you're talking about it, you talk about industry pressure for the family. And I was just wondering if that was something, with your first novel, if you experienced this and how that would apply to the book world. Because it definitely applies, I feel like, in all the arts.
That's exactly what I was going to say. It applies, I think, across the board in arts. There's this, and there's really a gift of purity writing a debut novel, because it's like I have no idea if anyone's ever going to read this. In my case in particular, I have absolutely no background in writing, and I had no connections in the industry. And so it was very much just the story I wanted to tell. And it was not till later that I thought, like, maybe people would like to read this. So then I started really learning more about the industry, and it's not surprising if you know about any arts industries, but you can get very caught up. And as particularly, there are people who it's their job, like my editor, agent, publicist, it's their job to think about what's happening in the market, and they're thinking of it as a business. And writers, oftentimes feel the tension with that because it's our art. And so it's books are both. But I think as a really voracious reader myself and as a writer, it has to first be like, what story am I passionate about telling? That has to be the first priority, or it just won't be as good. And I think there are plenty of writers who have experienced that, where they try to write toward a trend, or they try to write toward what they think the readers want. And it's typically just not going to be as good of a book as something that particular author is passionate about. So yeah, I wasn't trying to like at all, reference the publishing industry or take a dig, but I think that's something all art, and it felt very genuine to me that Ryan would be like, no, I don't have like big ambition, corporate ambitions for this. Like I really want this to be this particular thing. So that's no one's ever asked me about that particular line. So that was a great question.
So you did bring up a great point that you never even thought of being a writer, but yet you have this degree in family studies and a child protection certification from Harvard University, which I feel like definitely fills that topic of this book. So how did we go from that to now the bright years?
Yeah, that's also a great question. Yes, most of my work, I was a social worker off and on for almost 20 years, like starting as a volunteer when I was 17, working with foster families. So that was kind of my specialty, and I worked in all different sides of that residential treatment. I was a foster parent myself. I worked in the court side of foster care. And in, it was early 2020, like January of 2020, I read a novel called Lost Children Archive. And it is this very artful, beautiful novel that focuses on one family, but the backdrop is the crisis at the southern border, specifically with the children. Like it really focuses on that vulnerable demographic of children. And for whatever reason, like the book was right, the timing was right. I just finished that book and I was kind of like the obvious epiphany that everyone knows. When I say it, it sounds so obvious, but it was just like you can do anything with fiction, anything you're interested, and to me, that book, I'd read tons of justice oriented, family oriented nonfiction. But the fact that this book was so specifically telling a story that had to do with a demographic that I'm really passionate about and kind of talking about justice, but not in a way that was like agenda filled. As a side note that is relevant to this, I had one manuscript before the Bright Years. I guess it's not even a side note because it is directly answering. So as soon as I finished Lost Children Archive, I started a manuscript, and it was not the Bright Years. It was the one before the Bright Years, which I tried to. I mean, I just had no writing experience. I always loved reading and writing, so I was that kid, but definitely nothing formal. And that manuscript, I tried to talk about foster care, and I think I'll do that again someday when I'm have learned more. I do call it my learning manuscript because I got to the end of that and I was like, okay, I can write a whole book. I have like enough to say and I love the process of it. But that book, I actually did feel like had too much agenda. Like I just wanted to educate people about foster care, and I had never attempted writing fiction. And so some of it felt like nonfiction, some of it just wasn't working. And so I set that aside for a while, and I'm like, living my life. I have 3 kids, and I was working with. So it wasn't something that I was like, I'm trying to become a published author by any means. I just had done that. That was my first kind of outlet to really process everything that I've seen with the families I work with. So after a few months, I sat down again with a blank page on my computer, and I said out loud, and I kind of kept this before me the whole time. I said, my only agenda is to tell a beautiful family story. I had no outline. I had a conceit. And then I started, and I just kept telling myself let the characters, like discover the characters, instead of, I'm not trying to like talk about certain themes or address issues. Like I just feel like fiction can go off the rails when you have too much agenda, because as a reader and a writer, I feel like the best fiction is when the author is just asking the questions with you and exploring the questions with you and not trying to like offer answers. I feel like as readers, we can see through that. So I just kept saying to myself, my only agenda is to tell a beautiful family story, and like discovering. I always describe the process as being like reading, but better, because I truly did. I would sit down at my computer every night and be like, what's going to happen next? Because I didn't know. And that was a really, I mean, honestly, and we can talk about this more if we want, but I had no idea I was going to be writing about addiction and alcohol at all. And that's, of course, a very big part of the book now. But I didn't even know Ryan was going to be a main character at first. So it was a very much a discovery process, which was wonderful.
Well, you said something about processing what you went through as a social worker. I know I have a cousin who is a social worker, and it's a toll. I mean, there's a lot that it takes on you emotionally, physically, everything, right? But then you also mentioned in the book that art has the ability to heal. And hearing you speak about writing, it almost feels like it was a healing power for you, that rejuvenation, that recharge to get to give back almost for yourself, for everybody.
Yeah, it's interesting because some days it almost will feel like, depending on what I'm writing about, because it's such an exercise. Some of it is like I'm taking directly from my own experiences, whether personal, professional, and then sometimes it's just a complete exercise in imagination and you're just following like, what do I think would happen? Um, and so some days, especially with a book like this, it can feel like this is heavy and taxing and draining, and it feels like almost like like re-traumatizing to go there. But you can't write without learning, I would say. Like whether it's learning more about yourself and what you think about something. I mean, it is even for people, I think that, I mean, I can't speak for them, but I think people that outline, even as they go to put it on the page and go line by line, you are discovering something, whether it's about the story you're telling, the characters, your own thoughts about things. So it is a process of exploration anytime especially a long form project like a novel. So it definitely was a mix of both. Sometimes it was like the opposite of an outlet and it was hard. And then other times it was like, I can't stop, like, because I never even knew how to articulate this. And as I sit down, it's almost like it's weird. I know this is like weird, and I've never thought of it this way, but it's almost like muscle memory when, if anyone's like a pianist, like if you play the piano, you sit down and you could think you've forgotten the song and then it surprises you. And I feel the same way about writing. Like it's the story's just kind of waiting to reveal itself. So yes, it definitely.
I don't play the piano. I mean, I do know muscle memory, but sometimes that happens to me with lyrics. Like a song will
Yeah.
come on and lyrics are just coming out of my mouth, and I'm like, where is this coming from?
Yeah.
The
Yeah.
80s, probably. But okay, I loved it when Jet discovered through photography that she wanted to be a midwife.
Hmm.
And that was sort of a discovery in itself, but she also describes it as a doorkeeper to this hard and hardy world. And now I'm kind of picturing that as you as well as an author, because you
Yeah.
are now our doorkeeper for this story. Do you have some correlation there or any, feelings?
I I hadn't made that connection before. I think in my mind, that phrase in particular is her. She's like she has a really interesting, and a lot of this I didn't do intentionally, and then it made a lot of sense. So, for example, her photography was an art form that was put her in these situations and positions where she was like witnessing life from a safe distance. And art can be that, where it's like we're able to process without having, but she kind of had to confront, like, I mean, she's photographing families, weddings, births, nature too, but it's forcing her to confront these things. So sorry, I know I drifted from the question. Tell me, say
I was
again.
just talking about, I consider you also a doorkeeper, like in a lot of ways for
Oh yeah, the
us.
doorkeeper line. Yes.
Yeah. Um,
Yeah. So I was thinking more about like for her, she's realizing the doorkeeper of like really like welcoming babies into the world. I think it's interesting when you're in that world at all, and there's a lot of overlap. I mean, I was with foster care, so it wasn't the same, but there's overlap. The people who are interested in being like midwives, doulas, people working with birth, they often also will at some point have an interest in working with people who are at the end of life. There's something almost sacred and really special about that, those times of life when people are coming into the world and when people are leaving the world. And I think that was what the connection that Jet was making.
I do think that this book would be a great book to also read with the book club, with the collected regrets of Clover, which is a death
I
duel.
read that.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Okay, let's move into this. We start to say goodbye before we even get to say hello, sort of that theme. I think we're moving into a little bit of what you just talked about with that. I loved that phrase and kind of the cyclical
Hmm.
um, feeling of this book in general.
Hmm.
So,
Yeah.
okay, so now I'm going to go into, you mentioned at the beginning that this was epistolary, but yet you also ended the book as an epistolary because the grandfather Ryan writes it to his granddaughter.
Mhm.
Were those already in the story, or did you like just leave those letters and decide that that's the way you wanted his voice to be heard, or how did that work in?
Yep. Yeah. So the entire thing was letters at first, and I kind of came to the point where I realized it would be better told in first person present because I already write very reflectively, and with letters it was almost like that's all it is reflective, and so I just rewrote it so we could experience going through it with them instead of reflecting on it. And I mean, I did a whole rewrite where I really was like, okay, changing from letters to first person present. But even in that, at first, I had left maybe 8 or 9 letters from all three of them. And then as I kept editing and kept revising, it got cut and cut and cut until what we were left with was just, okay, it's still powerful to include these letters from Ryan specifically. So they just were kind of the lone survivors.
Well, why did you want, I mean, because you had to decide who is going to tell parts of the story,
Yeah.
but you did give us an alcoholic's perspective. I mean, which I think was very powerful. Why did you decide to do it and do it at the end? Because I think that also made a difference in the story.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, I'll tell you the kind of messy process of how it came about. My conceit originally was just Lillian and Georgette primarily. I think I mentioned earlier, Ryan surprised me. I was going to just be writing letters between a mother and daughter. I always knew that Lillian was going to die young and that she had this son, but then she's raising Georgette. So that was my original conceit. And then so writing it in letters was like Lillian has this daughter and she knows someday I'm going to want to tell her about my history. And I think a lot of parents have experienced this. You have a child and even when they're still babies, you start thinking like, I always say at the heart of this book is the discovery of parents as people. Not everybody has children, but everybody has a family context that we're born into that we have no control over. And that was my original premise was like Georgette is going to have to make sense of who her mom was, but she's gonna have to do it like after her mom is gone. So I started writing, Lillian's writing Georgette letters, and I was like, well, she has to tell her about her dad. Who's her dad? And I was trying to write this guy off the page and get him, he's not going to be a main character. He's not really going to be in their lives. And so I, was giving him this story of he left them and he was struggling with an addiction. It was like as soon as I started writing that, it really was like this character that represents so many real people and real stories was tapping me on the shoulder and saying, don't make me a stereotype. Like, don't make me so flat. Give me more of a breadth of humanity. Like, I just have more of a story. And so he wouldn't stay off the page. And so he became a much more important character and a bigger character. As I realized I'm writing a lot more about him, I thought about my friend, and I think he probably was kind of in my subconscious as I was making these decisions initially. But I had a friend um, from early childhood, like kindergarten through college, and I moved around a lot, so it was amazing that we both, and so did he. So we stayed friends. His dad struggled with drug addiction, and my friend, we still have a piece of paper from like third grade. He did one of those school assignments where the journals where they ask the kids like, to write about your fears. And he had written in third grade cursive that his greatest fear was becoming an addict like his father. His story is very tragic. He died in his early 20s. He left behind a 4-year-old daughter. And I was there for all of that. And so I think that's probably why, one of the main reasons why. And in social work I've worked with a lot of families with substance abuse issues. I don't have any direct personal experience, but I think like so many people, a lot of secondary experience. And my friend was one of them. And that generational cycle is already something that it's really important for me to explore the nuances and humanity of generational cycles and the reality of that. And anyways, my friend's name was Ryan. And so I ended up naming Ryan Bright after him and just kind of thinking, this is almost like a reimagining of what if he had lived longer? Like it wouldn't have been no struggle. I know that much. But what might it have been? So Ryan Bright wouldn't stay off the page, and it ended up that the book, started and ended with him. So I had those Lillian's letters. I knew I was doing Lillian's letters and then Jet's letters. And then we would finally hear from Ryan. I always wanted him to be, once I realized he was a big character, I always wanted his inside perspective to come at the end. And originally that was the structure. It was letters, but it was that same structure. And so that's how it developed. And when I transitioned it to be first person present, the structure still seemed to work.
Okay, let's talk about the motherhood part of this book, because you are a mother. You are writing, coming from that perspective as well. But there's such a time warp, I feel like, in this book, even though you're giving us the dates and the times, like how fast things move or slow things move, things happen in the blink of an eye. Was that intentional as well?
It's like I feel like I'm giving the same answer, all the intentional and like sort of is always my answer to that. It's almost like it starts intuitively, and then I realize what's happening, and then I like flesh it out with more intention. I feel like most of the questions you've asked about intentionality, that's usually the answer, and that is the answer in this case because you can structure a book's timeline in so many different ways. There are books, the entire book is one 24-hour period. It's just a very different experience. So this experience, because my original conceit was I want us to see this, particularly this daughter, grow up like from birth through adolescence and into adulthood. That's covering a lot of time. And so it's more like we're hitting the highlights, the very notable things in their life, and then we're zooming in on some of those scenes. But then we're skipping some of the details in between them, and yeah, and I think, and some of it is just it was a very intuitive writing for me. Again, I think partly because I have no education in writing, and so it was always like that. It wasn't like I tend to probably underwrite, and I think that's less common. I think most authors overwrite and have to cut a lot. And in my case, it was like, I told the story and then I needed to maybe add more or give more detail. Specifically in this book, I needed to give more early scenes with Ryan and Lillian because that was the part where I hadn't even realized Ryan was going to be so much a part of the story. So going back and adding instead of cutting is just what it was like for me personally.
Well, Jennifer said she really loves how the story started and ended with Ryan, that full cycle that we talked about. I think as a parent of, I have a kid that just went off to college, so I'm coming at it with a little bit different perspective. Mm-hmm. But, when you said things like keeping a child, it's like keeping the sky always with me, but never mine. Things like holding on is more painful than letting go. Things like that were really hit me probably maybe in a different way than other parents, but it was just, it did seem so real throughout. So thank you for being that vulnerable, open person, and giving us all of that.
It was important for me to start, not just Ryan, but to start and end with a child. I really wanted to start and end with a child. I think it's important for us to explore, and in this book, we did explore how parents' decisions and lives impact their children. But I also wanted us as readers to remember how children impact their parents. Parents change their children's lives, but also children change their parents' lives. And so, and oftentimes for the better. And also the other thing about particularly starting with a child with Ryan is that reminder of we're not going to make excuses for his behavior, and it's fair to be mad at him. But also, the question is literally in the book, and I don't have an answer to it, where we ask, what's the difference between an excuse and a reason? And I think there is a difference. I think we can say, well, you had the cards stacked against you from childhood. You had a very difficult childhood. You have also maybe this genetic component, and you're working against what maybe other kids aren't working against. And at some point, you have to take agency and make decisions, and you end up hurting your family. And we're not going to make an excuse for that, but we are going to understand like the psychology of how you've been impacted since you were a child. And there are those moments where, even Lillian very graciously. And she can't always think about it like this way, but she's kind of hit over the head with this, like, I'm all of a sudden I see him as a baby, a toddler, a little boy, the man, a teenager, the man he is now, the man he'll be in the future. And that kind of, I think children help us look at people outside of time. Like, remember that everyone is a whole person and more than who they are in just that one moment. And I really wanted that with Ryan, and I wanted him to be understandable as a human. And we can be mad at him and understand and have a bit of sympathy for him at the same time. I think it's certainly a tension to hold, but that was, yeah, part of why it's just super important for me to have start and end with children.
Well, at Wild Rose Reader, she said she was astounded at how much sympathy she had for Ryan. This was even sort of against her will. And I think that was very intentional on your part, because you did want to have real human family stories that, told the full picture. Do you get that a lot of feedback on that, on especially with Ryan, and just the family dynamics with all of them?
Yes, I do. I get a lot of people saying, that it's relatable, and specifically that same thing about sympathy for Ryan. And I really appreciate that because I felt that way as a writer and as I was exploring him, and also as someone who has worked with a lot of families and parents who are really struggling and really making bad choices. And I just always think there's just so much to any one person's story. And so it was interesting because I loved it. I had a bookseller who was interviewing me, and she kind of pointed out that Ryan's father, Barton, pretty much always see of him as awful. And he kind of is the stereotype, I think, that I originally was trying to make Ryan, and I just couldn't let myself do that. But it was so interesting because this bookseller said, by the time we get to the end, it's not that we see anything necessarily good of Barton. We see like pretty awful stuff. And yet, because we've had this whole journey with Ryan, it also just makes us realize, or at least wonder, like, what happened in Barton's life? Like, what was his childhood, and what is, and on the note of generational cycles and generational trauma, I will often say, kind of in defense of Ryan, that he did better than his father did. And that is often the hope with a generational cycle. And hopefully, it's always my hope that readers end the book with, I know that it's a sad book, but I'm hoping that they're feeling a sense of hope, because we see Jet and Kendi. So Ryan did better than his dad, and then maybe she's doing better than that. We have no reason to think that she is or will struggle with alcohol. And so he struggled the whole book. He had several seasons of sobriety, but it was an ongoing struggle, but he was trying. I mean, even his decision to leave them, I think that's when it changed for me, as I was like, he's just the stereotypical dad who leaves his family. And then I realized, except for he's not leaving them because he doesn't care about them. He's leaving them in his mind because he does care about them, and he's scared of himself, and he's seeing himself spiral, and he's like, I've got to go. This is how I protect my family. Now, of course, we get to like Lillian and Jet process that differently. And we get to the point where, later in the book, and Jet's like, he basically says that to her. He's like, I was trying to protect you guys. And she's like, no, you just chose alcohol. And that is how children of alcoholics often feel, rightly so. But yeah, so Ryan is such a nuanced character, and I really appreciate that people have sympathy for him. And again, I don't think it's making an excuse. We have the scene with Lillian and Elise, where Lillian is like, I don't know, was it abuse? Like these words, abuse, and even alcoholic. When she first calls Ryan an alcoholic, he's kind of like, he hasn't thought of that label. And that's also very common with people with alcoholism. Like the labels and the words are so easy to see from the outside, but when you're in it, especially in a relationship with someone you love, and they really did have great love, maybe 80% of the time you're good and things seem normal. And so that's why it's so hard to pinpoint and to say, in this percentage of the time, something's bad, like something's starting to go wrong. Anyways, yes, I love Ryan Bright too, despite his many mistakes.
Well, I do think this is a book of hope, because like you said, there's no reason, there's no like direction that Kendi and Jet are not going to succeed. As a matter of fact, it's the exact opposite relationship as what Lillian brought up with Ryan, and that they were brought together by pain.
Yeah.
And that's a hard thing to ground a relationship on and hope it succeeds forever. Whereas Kendi and Jet's relationship started from love, from a kindred spirit, which I thought was beautiful. Can you talk about that relationship based on pain a little bit?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I know I'm trying to process even what you said because there's some of both in both. And I do think it can be a powerful starting point for people because like anything, we want to connect with each other. And when we feel like you understand me, you've had losses too, and in that way we're able to connect even if it's not something we're talking about, which is part of the problem with Ryan and Lillian is they were trying to, like many people, many young married people do this, especially with difficult childhoods and difficult backgrounds, is like, let's just start a new life and forget about all of that. And especially then when you start having your own children, things do come back up and you have to figure out a way to deal with those in a healthy way, which was where they struggled. I think they had very real deep love. I don't think it was only the pain, but then it was just that they were ignoring that pain. And then Jet and Kindy, they also, I think, had some of that same connection because they both had losses. Um, but I think one of the main differences with them is they started addressing some of that, and looking at it and not running away from it, maybe in the way that her parents did.
Yeah, I think
Um,
children have a different way of open dialogue too, at least they did, because they could just say the things that were very blunt and out, and they, for the most part, kept it up when they were talking to each other.
yeah, I see everyone talking about the secondary characters.
Yes, please.
And I love that everyone's like bringing that up because so many people's favorite characters are Elise or Shauna or Kindy. As many people, like if you ask people, readers, their favorite characters, some of them will say Ryan, Lillian, and Jet, but as many readers will say, I would say the most common answer is Elise, which I love because she has definitely her moments of not being like she's not perfect. She's not perfect and pure, but we open the book with her strength. We open the book with her in the 50s with nothing, choosing her son over a dangerous situation with a husband that she also loved. And we don't get like as much of their story, but she is so loyal and faithful to Ryan. And then when he starts struggling, and I know someone is kind of mentioning this in the chat, but the dynamic between Elise and Lillian not having her parents, and Elise having this profound love for her son. But then when she realizes he's spiraling, is he doing the same thing his dad did? And that's not okay. And so it's like she also has this daughter-in-law who she loves and this granddaughter who she loves, and she's not going to make excuses even for her son. So I can't personally like imagine being in that position. Well, I guess I can't imagine it a little because I did to write Elise, but um, yeah, I love her. And I think this element of how there's a line in the book about the ever shifting composition of family, and families are always changing with births and deaths and marriages and divorces. As the years pass, the families change, and then found family is so important when there's brokenness in a family. And I just saw someone recently leave a review and they were talking about how they related to Jet and had such a similar story, but they didn't have a Shauna or an Elise, and they wish they did, because that is, you get your found family, and that's really, and of course Elise was family by blood, but with Shauna and Kindy and just having those people that, and I think that was huge for Jet to have with Kindy, was one of them. After Lillian died, Kindy was like the consistent person in her life. And that means a lot to people, the people who stick around, whether they're family by blood or not.
I am going to go into rapid fire questions. All right, are you ready?
Yes.
Brooklyn
So
or Fort Worth?
does this mean I need to answer like short answers?
Yes.
Okay.
Unless you feel like warranted.
That's a big ask for a writer, but I will try.
I know. And it sometimes is a success and sometimes maybe not so much, but it's fine either way. All right.
Okay.
Brooklyn or Fort Worth?
Fort Worth.
Madeline or Frog and Toad?
Oh my gosh. Madeline.
When writing, are you sunlight or moonlight?
Sunlight.
Sunrise or sunset?
Oh, sunset.
Uh, all right. Sweet or unsweet tea?
Sweet.
Favorite Bluebell ice cream?
Don't get mad at me for being so, well, actually, cookies and cream. I was going to say vanilla. I do love just plain vanilla bean,
Yeah,
but cookies and cream.
homemade vanilla is pretty good.
Yeah,
Okay, this one might be harder. Brisket or Bluebell?
brisket.
All right, are you an organ donor?
Oh, I can't answer this one right. I actually am, like on my license, but I've been like, I've been thinking it through more. I have been for many years, and I've been thinking about it. So I'm not sure if that will stay or not. That's my
Well, I think it's a
short
great
answer.
conversation for all of us to have. So thank you for answering all those rapid fire questions. And I'm going to open the floor to the audience, to all you readers. Does anybody here have a question for Sarah? Raise your hand if you would like to, but I'm going to go ahead and ask while we're waiting because I have, oh, wait, Anise already beat me to it. I'm going to go ahead and add you and get you to ask your question.
Thanks, LB. Thank you, Sarah, for being here tonight. Um, I I love the book, and as a debut, I was kind of stunned when I did not know going in. I think that it was a debut, so very very well written. With especially with all the issues that you dealt with and all the characters you dealt with, and I love the way that it just was all seamless and like LB talked about that. That there definitely is a lot of grief in the book, but then there's so much love and so much positive too that I think it makes it just such a great read. But I'm very curious. I know you talked a little about Ryan not being changed as you were writing. Was there a character that changed a lot from the first draft to the final draft that maybe changed the way your story went?
That's a good question. There really wasn't. I felt like I got to know them as I wrote them, and no, nobody had any big change. Um, I did speak with several people who were so generous with me, who either have struggled with alcohol themselves or have someone in their home and love someone who did, and those conversations were very impactful to me. Um, as I was writing Ryan, two of the main takeaways were that I was a little worried. I was like, I don't want to make alcoholism too big and bad if it's not really like that. I don't want to be too dramatic about it. I didn't want to be too dramatic. I really didn't want this book to be melodramatic in any way. I don't want to sensationalize trauma or difficulty, but everyone I talked to was like, you can't. It's so bad. It's so hard. You can't make it too big. Everyone I happened to talk to affirmed that. And so I just went kind of unfiltered and was like, okay. But on the other side of that, like, the other thing that shone through those conversations was how love and affection remains despite people could say to me things like that. My dad, a lot of times it was a dad, interestingly, but then I also had spouses, but this person like ruined my life, and also I love them as much as anyone in the world. Like, so that was, as we've already kind of touched on, like taken to the page. And I've experienced that in the families I work with too, that, the good memories and the affection don't go away. That's part of what makes it so painful. And I always say, like, it's important to me to write with unflinching honesty, but part of honesty is hope. So yes, that's a long answer to none of the Ryan was the one I had to find the most, but I kind of did that in the process. So there wasn't like I went back and had to change any characters.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, Morgan, go ahead and ask your question.
Hi, thank you. Sarah, you and I had actually like chatted on Instagram. I think it's so cool that you talk to
Yes.
people and repost stuff. I'm just
Thank
curious,
you.
do you have another book in the process?
Great question. I do. It is already with Simon Schuster. We're almost done with edits. So it's not official yet. The hope is that it will be out in June of next year. And if not June, it will be in the fall. It is unrelated to the Bright family, but it's another multi-generational family saga. Can't wait
Okay,
for that.
do we have a title, working title that we can be on the
Yes,
lookout for?
yes. And I think the title's official now, which is it's called The Burning Side.
The Burning Side. All right,
Yeah.
great question, Morgan. Thanks for unveiling that. All right, Shelley, will you go ahead and ask your question?
Thank you so much. Sarah, thank you so much for this. And I kind of fell into this book and I read it within like 24 hours last weekend, and was just blown away. And I am a birth mom and I actually was married to an alcoholic. And you nailed like nail on the head with addiction and alcoholism in such a positive way, if that's even something that can be done. Um, to have compassion for an alcoholic is really hard. And I think that you have just like opened the door for that. So I just really wanted to like acknowledge that. And you just like this book is just everything. And I was like, oh wow. And then I was going to ask if you had another book, which you let us know. But I just like I could like these characters are living in my head rent free for the past week. But you just like this book, I have not read a book like this in over a decade. So thank you so much.
Shelley, thank you for sharing that. It means so much to me. It means so much when anyone resonates with the book, and there are enough universal things that even without those personal experiences, people can, but it does really mean something to me when someone, shares, I had this experience too, and I saw myself or saw my experience in some way in the pages. It's interesting because as a writer, I think writers write for maybe a different reason than we publish. You can write anything. Like we were talking about writing being an outlet or being therapeutic. But then when you get to the point where like, I'm going to share this work, there's some other motivation. Like for me, it's like I really want some reader somewhere. I always imagine an individual reader. I never imagine like a plural. It's always like one person. Somewhere someone feeling less alone, feeling more seen. And so I'm so grateful to you, Shelley, for sharing that, and then just to all the readers who share things like that. So thank you very much.
Definitely. Thank you so much, Shelley. All right, I believe that Jill, I'm not seeing you anymore, Jill. Do you have a question? We will get back to Jill. I don't see her on the board
No,
anymore.
I'm here.
Oh, there you are. Okay,
Yeah.
good. There, go.
I don't know if it is kind of a question. I feel like I found many things remarkable about this book. I loved it. One of my favorites that I've read this year. But your ability to you use like very few words and you just do those one-liners. I know Laura Beth kind of referred to a couple of them, but they were sprinkled all throughout the book, and they were just maybe a short sentence, and they brought so much impact and feeling to me as I was reading. I was like, how is she doing this? I think Laura Beth said the one about keeping a child is like keeping the sky with me, but never mine. I mean, there's so many, and referring to so many different things. I mean, such short. I mean, do you have those sentences like there in your mind that you're trying to work into the book? Are you just like writing and then they just come out of you? Because they were incredible. I mean, just something very special about your writing for sure.
Thank you. That means so much to me. I'll try not to say too much about this because it's fun to talk about it, but I think, all writers have their strengths and weaknesses. For me, like plot and structure, I have to think about more. It's harder for me. I still have a hard time like describing the plot of this book. I'm like, I don't know, just read it. It's a family, going through family things. It's very hard to do. Character and line level come first to me. So it's a mix of it just comes out as I'm typing, and it's such a thrilling, wonderful experience. Because maybe I wouldn't have otherwise thought about it. then I also have this thing where I'll wake up in the middle of the night, or I'll be driving, or I'll be on a walk or taking a shower, and it's like, a sentence, a phrase, a beautiful word that I'm like, now I want to, and a lot of times this doesn't work and I have to delete it because I'll try to write a whole paragraph or scene just because I want to use this one phrase. And it's like, this is so, or I'll try to squeeze it back in. And I've had to, like, the manuscript I'm currently finishing edits on with my editor, there's quite a lot. It's like the whole book I'm the kind of person where like the whole book could be that. And that's what I kind of meant earlier when it's like a lot of it is reflective, because I have to remind myself to tell a story here and not just make these like sweeping statements. And it has to all flow naturally. And I'm so glad that it worked in the Bright Years. But my editor's keeping me in check on that one with this next book, because she's like, move along with the story. It can't all be these like one-liners, sweeping statements, whatever. But I love, as a reader, I love poetry, and I that's the kind of writing that I love and that means something to me. And so I especially take great delight in like concise lines where every word is important and maybe it has multiple meanings. Like you can read the sentence over and realize this is referring to this and it could be referring to this. So that's very delightful to me. So thank you for saying that.
It's delightful to me too. I mean, it really connected as a reader. It was wonderful. Thank you.
Same, Jill. Thank you for saying that, because I totally agree. Now there is another question. Jennifer said, what are you reading now? And I will add to that, is there a book that you would recommend, or books that you would recommend to us as readers?
Yes, I love this question. So I'll start with my favorite novel of all time, and one of my favorite writers of all time is Barbara Kingsolver. My favorite novel is The Poisonwood Bible. I also think that, speaking of like line level prose, I just think there's hardly anybody that compares to Barbara Kingsolver. I also love, in less specific books, but like Maggie O'Farrell and Dani Shapiro. If you liked The Bright Years, then you would love Dani Shapiro's Signal Fires. There's a lot of similarities. You're laughing?
I interviewed her with that book. So
Yeah.
read it and go back and watch her author chat, because it's really mind-blowing.
What's interesting is, in this past December, the one and only, like the first and only writing anything, like conference, retreat, anything that I've ever done, and still now the only one, was with her and 5 other women, and just spending like 3 days with her talking about writing. And it was incredible. So she is such a role model to me in this, and her writing is beautiful, very accessible, but very rich and deep and profound. I mentioned too, I love poetry. I love specifically Ada Lamone's poetry and like Mary Oliver. And then something to watch out for. My favorite book that I've read this year was an early copy of a book that's coming, I think, in November. And it is called The Ferryman and His Wife. And it is about a man. The premise is about a man who, like, it's his last day. He's entering into death. He's a ferry driver, and it's almost a little bit fantastical, but it's written very realistically. It's not like you're reading fantasy, but he is collecting and gathering on his ferry the people who he's already lost. You don't even know how or why, like, he's dying, but first you see this dog. He goes to his ferry and there's this dog who died 20 years ago. And then he's like, you're seeing these scenes from his life as he's kind of collecting his friends and people that he's lost, and all kind of building up to him reuniting with his wife. So it's very imaginative. But again, to me, it's always going to be, it's like, if the story is well told, if it's well written, if the line level just grabs me, I'll read anything. And this, like, line level, the way that he writes is incredible. So that's The Ferryman and His Wife, and it's coming in November, so that's one to watch out for. And then the ones that are already out, read Barbara Kingsolver and Dani Shapiro, and Maggie O'Farrell. Yeah.
Well, with the Dani Shapiro Signal Fires book, did she tell you about how that came to be published? Like, she wrote it forever ago and it was like in the closet. And yeah, I mean, to me, it just is like how timing sometimes it really was a fantastic book. So, so Shantha, that was the book you were asking about. This has been such a wonderful night of discussion. I mean, seriously, y'all, this was insightful questions, such great discussion. Sarah, thank you so much for giving us the ability to take home mountains, for reminding us that life isn't impossible to ignore as death. And I mean, what are we supposed to do with the shifting composition of family? I mean, you brought that up and it's so true. We will continue to contemplate the differences between a reason and an excuse, and most importantly, for sharing your otherness with us and for adding light just like so. So it was such a beautiful night. I really appreciate you being here and sharing this book. And like Anissa said, my mind's blown that this is a debut novel, and I cannot wait to read your next one. So great job. Keep up the good work, and don't let the pressures of industry get you. We are all behind you as readers. But readers, for y'all, in 1 week, we're going to be in conversation with national bookseller author Virginia Evans for, guess what? This is such a great, an epistolary novel called The Correspondent. This is what Ann Patchett described as a cause for celebration. So don't worry, you can be done with this book in a week. And I believe if you are Morgan, you might be reading this, or Shelley, you might be reading this in 24 hours. But I do promise that if you love audiobook, this is also one that I highly recommend that for. It's longlisted for the Center for Fiction, a First Novel Prize, as well as a PBS Top Summer Book and Library Reader Pick of the Month. It's a gem of a novel about the power of finding solace in literature and connection with people we might never meet in person. It is about the hubris of youth and the wisdom of old age, and the mistakes and acts of kindness that occur during a lifetime. So I feel like everybody here that loved Sarah's book is going to love Virginia's as well. So please find that book, read it, join us, and recommend both of these books to lots and lots of readers. If you are watching this recording, and all of y'all, please hit subscribe on my YouTube channel to help other readers find this content. And leave me a comment. Let me know what was your favorite part. And I will see everyone I know back in 1 week, because you don't want to miss this book or this conversation. And Sarah, we can't wait until next time when you give us another book. So we really appreciate you and all you've done.
Thank you so much. That was beautiful, using the lines from the book. And I am so thankful. I always like to want to take a minute to say thank you to the readers. My editor was sharing with me that this book, the word of mouth, has been unheard of for a debut. And I just constantly, I know that's because one reader is sharing it with another reader, and it means so much to me. So thank you for doing that. Thank you for hosting me and having me tonight. You guys are going to love Virginia and her book. And I'm also, that's the other thing I was going to say. I'm easy to find. I'm the only Sarah Damoff. I have a contact form on my website, and my social media that I'm active on is Instagram. And I try to be pretty responsive on that. So if you had further questions that you didn't get to ask tonight, or want to connect at any point, I'm around, findable. So
I mean, yeah, she can talk Buc-ee's, she can talk brisket. That's what I'm going to be. I need a little bit more Texas touch here. So I made a mistake. It's 2 weeks, everybody. You have an extra week, but I bet you read it in shorter than a week because it is that good. Sarah, you are delightful. Thank you so much for joining us, readers. Thank you so much for logging in on a Sunday night, and I will see everybody in 2 weeks. Y'all have a great night. Bye, everybody.
Bye.